but we think that's the perfect time for books, so we're glad that you're to visit all our dealers here today, as well as come hear our panel discussion. If it's your first time here at the museum, I welcome you and hope that you'll come back, and really hope you'll come back for further events that we also host around printing and book arts here. We have a print market in December that you're welcome to come to, and workshops year-round, so we hope you'll check that out and ask at our front desk. But today, in this theater here, we want to present a brief panel discussion with some local book collectors, and we're going to have Mr. Kurt Zimmerman here. He's in center. He's going to moderate as well as participate, and he's the perfect person for this programming, while he's a real estate agent by day, he's a book collector and appraiser by night, I like to say. And he's a UT graduate with a master's in library science. He went on to be an assistant at the Humanities Research Center there, and then ran the rare book and manuscript department at Butterfields in San Francisco. So he has a great deal of experience and a great passion for book collecting. He personally collects American books, bibliographic materials, as well as Latin American literature, and I'm sure he'll tell you more about that today. So I'll let him moderate and talk, but I will do a little plug for him before we get started and say do look at his website, bookcollectinghistory.com, as a little bit of his kind of expresses his passion. It has some of his talks on there and some more information about him as a collector. So please enjoy the conversation today, and we'll have a round of questioning at the end.
Be questioned. Thanks, Keelan. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here, and I'll let you introduce the other.
Bookcollectinghistory.com.
Bookcollectinghistory.com.
Yeah. What that is, it's a blog site, and I sporadically post basically things on the history of the book and book collecting. A lot of it coming from my own collections. But I just want to introduce myself again. Like Keelan said, I'm Kurt Zimmerman. And I have two distinguished collectors here that are local to the Houston area. And on my left here, I've got Bill Allison, and on my right, Doug Adams. You will also see them out and about at their booths. What I wanted to do is first just explain my background briefly and what I collect. And then these two gentlemen can give you the same information so you kind of know where we're coming from. I started back in college collecting Latin American literature. I was in a world literature class, and I read some of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the famous Colombian writer, and I started picking up books here and there, and I didn't have a lot of money, but I still, I was in Austin at the University of Texas, but I was able to find a lot of the books in English that were first editions, and I was a beginning collector. We'll talk a little bit about that. And from then I started collecting the Spanish material as well. So I've collected in that area for about 25 years now and have over 2,000 books in that collection. And then I also got interested when I was in the book trade. Shortly after college, I worked for a bookseller in Austin, a lady named Dorothy Sloan, who is a very high-level dealer in Texas material and the Western material. And she got my interests moving that direction. But I also got interested in the book trade itself and the book collectors and the book dealers, and so I started reading a lot of books about that. And that collection now has, I have at least 3,000 or 4,000 items in that collection. And these are special copies, things that were signed and annotated. Talk a little more about that. So anyway, my two main areas are bibliography, the history of the book, and Latin American literature. They're both totally opposite, different things, but I enjoy collecting both of them. And Bill, what's your areas of interest?
Well, I started collecting the Texas author J. Frank Dobie, and a couple years after I'd done that, one of the people who used to work at the Amon Carter said, "Oh, I bet you got interested in Tom Lee and Carl Herzog after that, didn't you?" I said, "Maybe." And so then after I kind of fleshed out a lot of my Dobie collection, I started collecting general ranching and Western books about the history of ranching and cowboys and cattle industry outlaws. It's kind of like that rancher who said, "I have very modest expectations. I am only interested in my land and the land that touches my land." So that's all. And,
so one book leads to another, so to speak.
It does, yes.
Douglas, what area you focus in?
Well, I actually started out as a reader,
What?
And so really my first area of collecting was biblio-mysteries, which I really enjoyed a lot. And basically these are just mystery novels where the plot revolves around, you know, like the murder of a librarian or curator of, you know, printing museum.
There's some people getting nervous in the room here.
So, but from there, I kind of moved into more like the history of the book, like Kurt. But, you know, and then I started buying these books, and I was buying so much stuff that it was Oscar Graham from Graham Book Gallery here that really kind of forced me to focus my collecting. So I moved more from like the history of the book and biblio-mysteries, and I combined the two into literary forgeries, which they're all true stories, you know, nonfiction, but they're like mysteries. And so literary forgeries are basically imitations of literature meant to deceive. And that could be anything from false authorship, you know, to the false age of a book, you know, and so there's all kinds of different areas there.
Well, yeah, and Douglas, it should be noted, he's going to be modest about his collection, but it was the subject of an exhibition right here at the Printing Museum. When? How many? A few years ago, they had a full.
Oh, yeah, it was like 2007, maybe.
They did a full-blown exhibit. Tom Taylor, some of you may have heard of, he's was a pretty high-level printer and dealer here. He came and gave the talk, but so it's a pretty fascinating area. But the diversity you'll see among us, we have some overlap in our collecting, but as collectors, you know, what you want to do is just find that item or that interest, that area of interest, and then pursue the items in it. And it can be a lot of different subjects. But, you know, we were talking earlier, and, you know, how did you get, a lot of people ask me, how did you get started in collecting? Well, I kind of mentioned, you know, when I was at the University of Texas, I went over to the Rare Book Library. A professor took us there when I was an undergraduate. I had an English course. He took us to the Ransom Center, which is the big Rare Book Library. And he had original letters by Edgar Allan Poe and books by Mark Twain. And so I got really excited to see the real stuff. And when I looked around, you know, I asked some questions, and I found out that a lot of these books had come from private collectors originally, and those collections had gone to the library. And so I'd always been a collector of many different things, beer cans, coins, all that kind of stuff. And I always was a big reader, so it was a natural evolution for me to start collecting books. Bill, how did you get, what sparked your interest when you were?
Well, it was a couple of things. My friend Dean Stephen Alton at the A&M Law School did two nice things for me. He introduced me to my wife, and secondly, gave me a biography of J. Frank Dovey that I read and got sort of renewed interest in that. And then I happened to be accompanying my wife to an antique show back in the 80s, and there was a book dealer there, and he had a couple of Frank Dovey books, and inside it were some Frank Dovey letters. They were very reasonably priced, and I said, look what you can find out there. And so that kind of set the hook on it, and the rest is history.
Set the hook is a good thing. Once you get the hook set, it just keeps going. How'd you get started? I don't know if I even ever asked you that.
It was pretty much about the value of the book for me. As I said, I mean, I was a reader, and I liked reading hardbacks. And at the time, I was in the Army, and we had relatively small rooms in the Army. You know, but I had a little bookcase, and I had a bunch of books on the case, and this guy came in my room one day, and he was looking at the books, and he said, "Oh, wow," he said, "you got this, do you know what this is worth?" So, you know, and I said, "No, I had no idea." And so basically
So somebody with the fellow guy in the Army with you knew.
Right, yeah, and he introduced me to the value of the books that I had already had, that I had just been collecting as a reader.
Huh.
And then I got out of the Army, and basically kind of I started wheeling and dealing in books a little bit. So, and for the longest time, I mean, I would buy a book for $1 that I couldn't sell for 50 cents, but I eventually learned.
Yeah, I could, as a side note, Douglas and I go way back, and Douglas, is a great example of a collector who also works as a scout to help pay for his collection. I mean, none of us up here have the kind of money to buy the really expensive stuff unless, you know, we're going to mortgage the house or something. But you'll see a lot of that in collecting. You'll see a lot of people involved that will sell a little bit or trade or scout books. So Douglas is a great book scout. And in Houston, even though Houston is not a, quote, book-rich city with a lot of bookstores, like if you're up in New England or that area, there's still stuff out there. And maybe we can tell a little bit about that story and what you found. We'll talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
So, and speaking of acquisition stories, let's talk about that for a second. This was in your private collection for a little while, but you decided to sell it because it was outside your area. Tell them what it was,
Yeah.
the directory first.
So,
Lunch, right?
I
The
have
lunch
I have
break,
a regular job, you know, 9 to 5, whatever, you know, 8 to 6. But on my lunch breaks, I never eat lunch. I'm always out prowling around. I go Goodwill, Salvation Army, antique stores, whatever. And this is what I do on my lunch break. You know, one day I'm out on Westheimer, and you know the little antique stores down there, and I found this only book in the whole shop. It was inside the case, and I asked the lady, I said, well, how about this here, you know? She pulls it out. Oh, well, there's no price on it. So she said, how about XX price? And I said, okay, that'll work, I'll take it. And I figured, you know, I always had plans to resell it because that's what I do. I mean, I buy a book for cheap, I resell it for a little bit more, and it goes up the food chain. And that's how I finance my collecting. But this particular book was an 1866 City of Houston directory. And what was special about this book is that it was in the original boards, but it also had the fold-out map that came with the book. And so the map, you know,
Very
maybe
rare.
about 2 foot by 2 foot, and showed, you know, from, I guess, Buffalo Bayou and the little city right there, and Freedman's Town, and I think it's Freedman's Town,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
all of that. So anyway, I held the book for a little while. Of course, I called Kurt, straight thing. Hey, I found a good
He wanted
book.
a free appraisal is what he wanted.
And, so we put our heads together. Kurt kind of helped me come up with the value. And anyway, I mean,
It ended up-
let's just say I sold that book for about 100 times what I paid for it.
Yeah, so he financed his book collecting with that.
For at least 2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah, at least 2 weeks. Yeah, the money he made didn't last long, did it? It went right to some other books.
Yeah.
But, well, that book ended up in J.P. Bryan's collection, the great collector, Texas material, who now has a museum down in Galveston. So that'll show you that there was only less than probably, what, 7, 8 copies that we could
Yeah, I
trace
think
that
we
were known.
found 6 copies, I think, in libraries, but out of those, we really couldn't identify how many had the maps, but not very many.
But it's a good example just in general that, you know, anything can, McMurtry said that in one of his novels, Cadillac Jack, he was talking about an antiques dealer. Anything can be anywhere. He goes out on his lunch break, goes to a little antique place on Westheimer, and it turns up just a phenomenally rare book. And the good thing is, that book could have been lost. I mean, literally, there's probably less than 10 copies known. The first city directory of Houston with the map. And although, you know, he wasn't collecting Texana, so he didn't keep it, he was able to identify it, buy it, and now it's in a very important collection. So who knows what could have happened to it? It could have been easily lost. So that's another thing that collectors do, whether you keep it or you find it and maybe get it to somebody that's focusing on it, is collectors save a lot of material that otherwise might be lost.
And one thing that I really like to do, I mean, you know, I don't try to milk every single cent out of a book that I find. I like to make sure that they go to a good home or somewhere that they're going to be appreciated as well. So.
What about you, Bill? I know you found some things over the
Well,
years for your collection.
I do have another anything can be anywhere story, which is my wife and I were up in Massachusetts this summer, getting out of the Texas heat, and I convinced her we should go to a little regional book fair in Northampton, Massachusetts, home of Smith College. And sure enough, I found 2 1830s Texas, pre-Republic items, one pre-Republic, one Republic era. And, I had no idea there would be anything like that there. So,
In New Hampshire.
Pretty fun, yeah. One published in Houston in 1839 by the Telegraph Press, which is pretty unusual to find. So, it's really true. You never know what might be lurking out there in Northampton, Mass, or anywhere.
Well, I was gonna.
I told Bill earlier, I said the best place to find Texana is out of Texas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's amazing. That turned up in New Hampshire, something that rare. Well, I've got an acquisition story which these guys may have heard. He was involved in it, but you guys probably haven't heard. It kind of shows what happens when you get to a certain level of collecting. The bibliomania sets in. Larry McMurtry, you guys heard of, famous author, Lonesome Dove, a number of other works. He has a big bookstore in Archer City, Texas, and in 2012, he downsized the bookstore. He had about 4 buildings. It's where he grew up when he was a kid. It's a small town, literally like a one-stoplight town. But at one point, Larry, a lot of people don't know this, he was also a big bookseller as well as an author. And so he had a huge used bookstore in Archer City. It was in 4 different buildings. There were probably 500,000 books total at the store. Some of you may have been there, but if you hadn't been there, it was amazing to behold. But Larry in 2012 had some health issues, and he decided to auction off most of it, like wholesale most of it. He told me, he says, I don't want to leave this with my kids. My kids don't care about all these books, and if something happens to me, they're going to be stuck with 500,000 books, and what are they going to do? So he was being proactive. So Douglas and I heard about the sale. I went there with the idea of not really bidding on anything because it was going to be in big group lots. You know, there were 300 or 400 books in each lot. Well, we're there, and there's a lot of people, and we're meeting booksellers from all over the country that came in, and I made the mistake of getting a paddle. I did register for the bidding. And so, I mean, there's literally 1,000 lots in this sale. It went on for 2 days. And each lot, it was in the bookstore, and they would just take this big shelf of 300 books on architecture or literature, and that was the one lot you'd bid on. Well, it's getting late in the first day, and it's hot, it's August, everybody's getting kind of tired, and there was a big collection of Latin American literature. Okay, this is my area. There's one book that I wanted to buy in a 300 lot book lot, and so I raised my paddle, and before you know it, I buy the whole thing to get one book, and I'm like, wow, okay, that went pretty well.
And they were stringent that if you bought a lot, you could not leave the lot. You had to take them all with you. You had to take them off the premises.
So he looks at me and he goes, "Hey, you got that pretty cheap." And I'm like, and then the next lot comes up and it's the same subject, and I'm like, well, why not? And so I bid, and so within 30 seconds, I owned 600 books just to get one, and I'm like, well, okay. So I went back there and I looked through this stuff, and when I looked at it closely, I ended up getting about 150 books out of it that were a little bit different editions, or like an English edition or a variant. So it worked out well for me. So I had all these books, and I was savvy in the sense of, I'm like, this isn't going to fit in our little SUV. One of the booksellers there, who was literally buying thousands of books, I took what I wanted and I said, "Do you want these?" And he said, "Sure." So I got those off the plate. But that was not the bad part. The bad part was the next day. And they were auctioning a building that had all these pamphlets and auction catalogs and all this biblio stuff that gets me excited. So I look at this and I turned to Douglas and I said, well, I'm going to try to buy this stuff. And next thing you know, I own 3,000 or 4,000 pamphlets and just a whole wall of this stuff. And so he looks at me and he goes, "I think I can get them all in your car, your SUV." And I look at him, I go, "Man, there's no way. I don't care how good a packer you are." So we call around. Every U-Haul is gone. Everybody that's there has already rented every U-Haul out. He comes up with the idea, Wichita Falls Airport, the rental cars. They had one Ford Expedition left. And so we get that. We load both vehicles up. There's like 60 boxes of books. We're not going to buy anything. We're coming back with 60 boxes of books. And so on the way back, he tells me, he says, "Well, I can't take them to my house." And I go, "Well, there's no way I can take them to my house. So what are we going to do?" I said, dial, "Mom, hey Mom, Dad, can I borrow your house for a few days?" So my parents live close by. We drive 6-7 hours back to Houston, and we load up my parents' hallway with about 60 boxes of this stuff. And my mom's just looking at us going, when is that going to get out of here? And we're like, okay. So we got a storage unit, put them all in a storage unit. We spent about a year or two sorting them. And there's still a bunch in his garage if anybody's interested. We got some extra. So what started out as a pursuit of one book ended up with 50 or 60 boxes of
What
stuff.
was the book?
It was Mario Vargas Llosa's The Time of the Hero. Mario Vargas Llosa's the Pulitzer Prize winner, or not Nobel Prize winner. It was his first book, the English edition, which is scarce. So for that one book,
Good job.
I got it. So anyway, so you can see what happens sometimes. But I did get a bunch of material out of that, and my long-suffering wife is here, so she's still with me. So that's a good sign. But you know, what I was going to talk about, we could get into this and start talking book stories all day long, which is fun. But I wanted to try to talk a little bit about. Can you guys hear me in the back? We can turn this off if it's, because it's kind of messing up. Yeah, just turn it off. And if you can't hear, we'll just talk louder. Now, okay, so we've introduced ourselves. We're talking about acquisitions. You can see we're out and about, even though we have our regular jobs, our day jobs. When you become a collector, you get interested in different areas. Some advice would be probably helpful if you're just starting out. The key thing is to, once you find some areas you're interested in, is to learn absolutely as much as you can about the area before you start spending any real money on the books. Find out, there's bibliographies available, there's general histories, there's biographies. Get a feel for the area first, and those will lead you to different books. And when you find out what the important books in the field are, nowadays with the internet, you can go online and you can search for those books on different sites and see which ones are for sale and start getting a feel. Books, you know, some books will vary wildly in price, and a lot of it has to do with condition or the dealer that's offering it. So you start doing that, but nothing beats coming to like a book fair like this, or going to a spot where you can actually, or bookstore, where you can see the books, feel them, get an idea of condition. Book collecting, just like any other field of collecting, conditions really critical. When I was doing the appraisal clinic this morning, for example, this woman brought me a children's book that it was in pretty good shape, and so it might be worth X, but if it was in mint condition, it could be worth 3 times that much. So that is another thing you'll get a feel for as a beginning collector, is learn your area, and then also remember conditions important. Even on the older books, we've got a distinguished collector sitting here, Steve Hamilton, who collects 19th century literature, and he has some fantastic copies. He waits for the best copy to come up that he can get. So that would be some advice. That was a lot of the internet stuff nowadays. How do you use the internet to find stuff? What's one of the things you do that besides hunting bookstores and stuff?
Yeah, you know, surprisingly enough, a lot of my material actually comes off eBay, and my collection's so specialized that I can hardly go to an open shop or a bookstore or a book fair and find anything that I'll need or want for my collection. So I utilize the internet heavily, and whether there's some book search sites like ABE Books is one, and what's the other one? Via Libre. But eBay, I've done pretty well on eBay, and the benefit to utilizing these sites on the internet is that you can put in want list, and so you can type in the author's name or the title, and every time that pops up on eBay, they'll send you an email and say, hey, you know, we found this book. Now, 9 times out of 10, it's, you know, a print on demand or something that's not really anything significant, but
every once in a while
we'll find something. And on Abe, for example, I mean, I've had my want list on there for 15 years, and you know, I mean, I've had books on there that I put on there originally that I've never had a single hit on, and they're just that scarce. So
I think you can't.
It's a big surprise.
If you become a serious book collector, you have to utilize those resources. It may not be quite as fun as walking into a shop, but like Douglas says, putting wants online. Bill, I know you have them on eBay and on Abe. I'm embarrassed to say I must have 500 wants saved online, different search terms covering Latin American literature, covering the Biblio stuff. And then eBay is important too, because in the old days, pre-internet, if some family had books or prints or something, that they wanted to sell, they would go down to the local bookseller a lot of times and sell them. Well, now a lot of folks want to put it online themselves and try to sell it directly. So that can be a hit or miss, but if you're an advanced collector, you can pick through that.
Yes, well, I just read this quote the other day, which said that, the proverb is that the early bird catches the worm, but in book collecting, the bird that recognizes the book is worth collecting gets the prize. And so a lot of things, I always tell people eBay is a big garage sale with all that caveats about what people don't know what they have or mistaken about what they have. But these days there are so many things. Oftentimes when I put my general search in there, I'll get 2 million hits on eBay. There's that many things on there, or 200,000 hits. So you have to narrow it down. But Kurt and Douglas and I often email each other when we've made a good find on eBay to share our stories. But oftentimes we're the only bidder on an item because there's so much on there that people can't look at everything. Even if you spend a few hours a week, you're not going to see 200,000 books. So you can find things on there for very reasonable prices oftentimes, and that's surprising perhaps, but fun when you do it that way. But you do need to know a little bit, as Kurt said, you need to educate yourself so that you won't make the mistakes that we all made. I bought book club editions thinking they were first editions when I first started. I bought ex-library copies because I thought it was the first edition that was more rare than it turned out to be, and other things. So there are a lot of mistakes you can make starting out, but the more you educate yourself, then the more you'll recognize a valuable worm when it's out there waiting for you.
Well, Bill, that happened to me early on when I was collecting Latin American literature. I found a copy of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, the first American edition, which is a valuable book. And I bought it at a book fair in Austin. The dealer had it marked as it says first edition on it. I bought it for like $75, $100. And back then, this was back late 80s, early 90s, that was a decent price for it. Now it's worth like $1,500. But anyway, it turned out to be a later printing, and there's a way you could tell that. And what I did, I took it over to another dealer. I had it in my hand, and he says, "Is that the first printing?" I said, "Yeah, I think it is." And he showed me what the first printing was, and it wasn't it. And so I'm like, oh, it's like a fourth printing. So I went back to the original dealer, who he just made an honest mistake too. He didn't know that information. He took the book back, which any reputable bookseller will normally do if there's a mistake made. But it just kind of shows you you're going to make a few mistakes when you're collecting, especially early on. Just be careful if you start spending any big money that you really buy from either a reputable dealer, or if you're on your own and you're on eBay, that you really know what you're doing, so that doesn't minimizes that risk. But we were talking. There's a lot of things you can tell a beginning collector, but I was thinking about what kind of advice could we give an advanced book collector? I don't know if we're maybe advancing in years, but no, seriously, I mean, somebody that's maybe been collecting for 20 or 30 years, what could I tell them if they came to me that would be helpful? I think it's really, really important, depending on what you collect, if you're an advanced collector, not to get too lackadaisical about the online material. You can really miss some stuff. I think the internet, the eBay, a lot of collectors say, I don't want to mess with that, but I would always have a few wants on there and keep my eyes open on that, and don't get lax on that. And then the other thing is, once you have your wants saved and you get emails, like if a book is loaded online, you don't have to spend every minute of your day looking at them. But just the other day, we were busy doing something. This happens. I didn't get to check my want till later that evening, and the book was already sold. So if it's really important and it comes up, just focus a little bit on that. Those are a couple things I was thinking about that have happened to me, even though I've been collecting for a long time. I don't know if you've got any ideas on that.
Well, I hesitate seeing some of the established bookmen in the audience that I would give them any advice that they would be able to use. But Kurt is right. One of the things I like to do is what I call time traveling. I get booksellers' catalogs from years ago, and they will have identified rare books not in the bibliographies of my area, and so I'll get online and look for them. And one of the things I collect is Western illustrators. So Frederick Remington, Jeff Dykes wrote this wonderful book about Western illustrators, and he says the most rare Frederick Remington thing in the world is an off-print from the Century magazine in 1890 about Rogers, Rangers, and the French and Indian War. There's 100 copies of this off-print. So I look online, there's a copy at a Boston bookstore I've been in many times. It's $20. I'm like, I'll order this. And sure enough, it came. And so I was very happy. And, you know, I'm sure if I'd been in the store, I might not have even been thinking about Frederick Remington illustrations. They didn't know what it was. And so you can make good finds on the internet.
Using the old
you know,
school reference stuff.
Yes, using these reference materials or bookseller catalogs from years ago. Jeff Dykes used to always highlight what he called unrecorded rarities. That is, they're so rare they're not in the bibliography of rare books. And so it's exciting to find one of those things. But the only way you even know to look for it is if you have the material, the reference material that tells you this book exists. Otherwise, you don't. How do you know to look for it?
Well, you know you have the bookseller or book collector bug when you start reading old bookseller catalogs and utilizing them. Well, Jeff Dykes, who you mentioned, I was just going to say that Jeff Dykes was a great collector of Western material, and then he started doing his book selling, but his collection's at Texas A&M. So just as a point of reference. But Doug, you got any ideas for?
Well, I reiterate, you know, the use of the internet. Kurt and I went out to San Francisco to the book fair out there, and this old crotchety guy, Peter V. Howard.
Serendipity Books.
Serendipity Books there in Berkeley, I guess, right? You know, I had this little strange book, The Winding Stair by Yates, and it had the Crosby Gage imprint and not the Fountain Press. The book came off the internet, super cheap, and I wanted to show it to Peter and took it into the shop.
Now, Peter, let me see. Peter's like one of the world's well, he just passed away. He was one of the world's great experts in modern literature.
Yeah.
And he could be a bit cranky at times. He was quirky. So Douglas wants to talk to him about this.
And so, I mean, you know, this guy is an advanced, not a collector, but I mean, he's a collector.
At the top of the food chain.
You know, he's top of the food chain. He's like, oh, well, where'd you find this? I said, oh, I found it online. You know, and so automatically right then the book was tainted. You know? I mean, he's like, oh, you found it online. You know? And, so
he was old school.
You know, so basically, I mean, that was the point of my story. But
what did he call the book?
He said it was a bastard copy.
But we still ate this food, didn't we?
We did. So yeah, no, I mean, look, don't discount the internet. And I mean, what's great about the internet is that you know, it's opened up book selling to people that don't actually know a lot about books, and so you can find some really good things. You know,
I think,
but then again, you got to be careful because you got a guy trying to sell a book that's not real knowledgeable about books, and they say, "Oh, well, it's a first edition," but sure, it's a first edition, 5th printing. You know, whereas in the book trade, you say first edition, it kind of implies, you know, first edition, first printing, where a collector is only interested in the first edition, first printing. So you got to be careful that way.
It's a learning curve to be a
is.
collector, and it really is helpful if you're starting out or even been in it for a while to know some of the booksellers and learn from them, like these guys. And there's plenty of examples here at the book fair where, you know, you don't have to feel like, oh, I have to buy all this stuff at once from them. Most booksellers, they're quirky a little bit, okay, but they're fun, and they're willing to give their knowledge.
Teach. Yeah.
They'll teach, and I mean, obviously, in general, it would help them. The more book collectors there are, but it's like finding a professor of rare books. If you can find a good dealer that will teach you, And just like what happened with me at the Austin Book Fair when I was a novice, that dealer didn't have to tell me, he didn't have to point that out, but he pointed out that the book I'd bought was not what it was supposed to be, and I would not have known that. So that is probably the biggest advice that we would give anybody starting out, is you need to find some, and fellow collectors too. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. As you can see, we know each other very well, but the collecting world, part of the fun is the hunt. We're talking mostly about the hunt today.
It's mostly about the hunt.
Mostly about the hunt. But it also, there's a satisfaction to it too if you're building a collection in a certain area and you're trying to complete a collection, or go where someone else has never really collected in that area before. So there's that aspect of it too. But it's the camaraderie and getting to meet the people and getting to interact and share your stories that makes up a lot of the fun.
Yeah, the other good piece of advice that I liked, it was in a fun book written by a Dartmouth English professor. It's called the Book Collecting for the Impecunious Amateur, which many of us were when we started out. And it was interesting because he collected English literature, and being on an academic schedule, he could go to England. Back in the day, this was in the 40s and 50s, he would go to England in the summer and buy English literature, and like the rest of us, he would sell some of it to finance the things he really wanted. But his advice was, if you have the best things, people will always want them. And as a seller, I've always found that to be true. You know, Larry McMurtry famously said, after the internet, it's easier to sell a $100,000 book than a $40 book. And there is some truth that I've never sold a $100,000 book. But oftentimes the more expensive and super rare books people are more interested in than the $40 books, because they can't find it anywhere else. You know, so if you have the best things, people will always want them.
Well, a couple things too, a little more detail when you're a collector and you find an area and you're interested in it, and you're exploring the area, you're buying material. One little bit of advice would be, find out what the most expensive items in that area are, maybe the high spots, because if you really want that, you need to make sure you can afford that area, because you may get a little frustrated if you start out and you gather all this stuff, but you cannot move and get the best stuff. And then the other thing would be, don't be afraid to step up and pay a real price for a really good book. We're always looking for bargains. Everybody loves a bargain, but when you're a book collector, sometimes the bargain is getting the book, not the price. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. And the ones you regret, the books you regret, are the ones you don't buy 99% of the time. It's the one you pass on. So if you get to that point where there's a special copy of a special book and you have to stretch for it, well, that's part of being a collector. You're going to feel that. That's normal, and don't be afraid to do it. So,
but again, don't think that, you know, if you're going to collect books, you have to collect all these high-end books, because I mean, Kurt and I both have, you know, $5 books and $20 books in the collection
that are important.
And they're very important, because as a whole, it makes the collection a lot more valuable. What was Barlow collecting? He was collecting these the cookbooks. What were they?
Oh yeah, the Duncan Hines cookbook.
Right, the Duncan Hines things. I mean, they were probably $20 a pop.
But
he had the whole collection. You know, that's pretty impressive.
Well, that's a good example. Bill Barlow is super advanced collector. Was head of the Grolier Club, 50 years a collector. He collects a lot of different things. And we visited him. He's out in Oakland, and he's collecting Duncan Hines guides to restaurants. And we're like, what is that? But he tried to get every single issue, and for 40 years, those were the guides that people used when they traveled and they went to restaurants, and he has an interest in restaurants. So what you think is, oh, that's kind of silly, that one, but when you have a run of them, you can see the whole history of restaurants and things like that in the cuisine.
On iTunes, your Rare Book School, he gives a talk about that collection.
Well, there you go. There you go. So, and then today I'll give you an example. There was a couple that came in that had some books for the free appraisal clinic. I look at them, and they're from the 20s, and they're basically books on how to educate your young man in terms of everything from sex education to manners. And these are books, individually they might be a $10 or a $20 book, maybe. but they really had an interest in this, and they said, well, look how they didn't really realize it until they started talking to me, and I gave them some feedback. They said, it's so interesting to see how that generation and that era, how they approach this. And I said, well, there's your collection right there. You said you could, if you gather a collection of 30 or 40 or 50 of these different books over that time period, it really gives you a window into history and what was going on. So that's an example too. That collection wouldn't cost you much money, but it would be great to hunt that stuff down and write about it and share that with other people. So yes, there's a lot of different approaches to book collecting. Everybody likes to own a really nice, famous copy of a book. We have some stuff like that, but it's kind of the small things, the out-of-the-way pieces too, that give me a lot of satisfaction, at least, to find them. So, you know, I was just making some notes here. How do you, if you're a collector, any level, and there's not that many bookshops that are open shops anymore, how do you get a feel for the books, like in your subject area? Here's a good example what you could do. Say you're interested in a certain segment of history or anything in general. If you go to the university libraries, a lot of the big graduate libraries are open stack. You can go up into the stacks, go to that area, because they're grouped by subject, and browse. You're not browsing a bookstore, but if you browse the stacks in your subject area of a significant library, you're going to see all sorts of things there. You're going to go, wow, I didn't know this existed, and oh, this is interesting. So it's kind of a different way. In the old days, you might be able to go into an open bookshop and do that, but the university libraries can teach you a lot about your subject matter just by osmosis and seeing things. You can handle the books too. You'll see what the bindings look like for the most part, and so you can kind of self-educate that way. And then another topic, Nicole and I, we went up to New England. We were actually visiting with Bill and his wife Pat up there, but we were in Boston area and Maine, and you can still do a book hunting trip where there were plenty of open shops. Not as many as there were, but there's still plenty of shops. But there's also a lot of booksellers that have a lot of material that they can't afford to have an open shop anymore, but those books haven't disappeared. They've moved them into their house or a warehouse. So once you're a collector versus just a general reader, you can look up these dealers in these towns, call them up, and they're more than happy normally if they're around. They say, please come on over and visit me and take a look. And it's almost even more fun because you're not going to an open shop. It's like having your own guide. They take you through their stock. So there are tens of thousands of books that are...
Added to that, with the first shop you go to, I'd say you have a listing of dealers, because they list people who deal from online, people who deal at home, as well as open shops, and they'll indicate that usually.
Yeah, and like in Maine, they have we were up in an area of Maine, and they actually had the booksellers in Maine, the rare and antiquarian booksellers, put out a pamphlet where they had all the ones that were active, whether they had an open shop or even that they worked out of their house. So yes, there's not as many open shops to go into, but there's still a lot of books out there, and a few phone calls, and you can go visit these booksellers and go to their house. The other thing that's...
They got the pretty scenery at the same time.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's pretty nice up there. I'm ready to go back. So I'm ready to go back. Yeah, the Northeast is still a great place to visit and do some booking. Now, California has a lot of bookstores, in Oregon and that side too. Texas doesn't have as many bookstores, but there are some good book dealers here in Houston and Texas area. But the other thing I wanted to point out is some things have changed since we've been collecting the last 25 plus years. What I've seen, there's a lot more focus on ephemera now because it's available, especially because it's online. Before, you might just have mainly books on a subject, maybe if you found some letters from the author, that was neat. But now the next level of collecting, because of availability, is ephemera. That's like posters and advertisements, promotional material, things that add a lot of visual interest.
But basically, I mean, stuff that was meant to be discarded or thrown away that kind of makes it scarce.
Yeah, so it's a good combination of scarcity and visual interest, and it also can tie into the collection. There's a collector, Nick Basbanes, you guys might have heard of him. He wrote the book Gentle Madness, and he's a book collector himself, and I was talking with him. He and his wife put together a collection of modern children's books. She did some reviewing of modern children's books over the last 40 years, so did he. So they have they have hundreds of children's books that were published, brand new, which is nice. However, his wife, Nick, goes, I wasn't going to do this, but she did every piece of promotional material that was sent for the review copies. They would send shirts. I mean, these are kids. They had shirts and 3D model stuff, and she collected it. And so that collection is going to go to a university. They're excited about the books, but they're super excited about all the ephemera, like 20 boxes of it. So anyway, it makes it a little more fun as a collector. You can branch out and do that.
One thing that I got for beginning or advanced collector, which, you know, I've neglected for almost 20 years, is cataloging my collection. And so, I mean, I got, you know, 400, maybe pushing 500 books in my collection, right? My primary collection. I've never cataloged it at all. I kind of got a general idea of what I got, you know, but Kurt is a great cataloger, and he's kind of even convinced his wife, Nicole, to, you know, I'll call up on a Friday night, hey, what you doing? Oh, we're sitting here watching TV and cataloging. You know?
Really exciting.
And, so
we do have some beers going too.
So really, kind of make a list of as you collect, make your list, you know, because, I mean, I've started just recently, you know, cataloging my collection, and it's like Christmas, you know, because, hey, man, I didn't even know I had this. You know, that's cool.
When you've been collecting for 20-some years. And
but the other side of that is that, you know, I got a stack of duplicates, you know, this high now that, you know, I bought 3 or 4 copies of the same damn thing.
We're gonna have to talk. No, that was a bit of advice that I got early on when I worked with a bookseller. She said, if you're gonna collect, she says, if it's in you, some people don't like the catalog, but she says, try to at least make a record of what you're cataloging, because someday you're gonna get to the point where you're not gonna remember everything you have. And not only when you catalog your material and you look at it closely, you learn so much more about it. That's part of the fun too. Yeah. And you can catalog any way you like. You can do a full-blown catalog. You can just do a short. But I would recommend, if you haven't started, start now.
Right. And that's one of the best things about the internet is doing research on books. So there's lots and lots of information easily available on your computer about the books, you know, and you know, even on the ephemera, I found on eBay a wonderful letter from a woman who was the wife of a prominent cattle rancher in California in the 1800s, and it told all about this disastrous trip she'd gone on to see her sister in Southern California, and she got stuck for 3 months by the flooding that washed out the bridges. So I put her name into the Google Books, and sure enough, there's a local history of which there's like 1 copy in a library in California, but it's online thanks to Google Books now, and relates a lot of information about her family, which I don't know how you would have ever found that before the internet. You know, this local history of which there's like 1 copy in the library in the United States without the internet to lead you to it. So there's plenty of tools out there to research the things that you find, and I agree with Kurt, that's a lot of the fun that I have, is researching and writing up the findings, your finds after you've gotten them. It's sort of like looking at your pictures after your vacation. You get to relive all the fun that you had finding it in the first place. So.
That's right. Well, and a lot of my books are what's called association copies. I love association copies and scribe material, and the internet has revolutionized the ability to do research. That to me is probably the biggest advantage. And so you can search names and signatures and inscriptions and the history of things. So that's part of the fun too. You know, we what I want to do now is I'm gonna finish up with some talk about a local club, the Book Hunters Club of Houston, which we actually established it's going on 2 years ago now. And after we get done talking, if any of you guys would like to get on our list, email list, we have events regularly throughout Houston area. Recently, we went to Texas A&M on a field trip, and they to their special collections, and they really rolled out the red carpet for our group. And this group we call it the Book Hunters Club instead of the Book Collectors Club, because it includes book collectors, of course, but book dealers who are book hunters, and special collections librarians who are involved in the books, and then, you know, other people that might have an interest that could be a printer or somebody that's into printing or such. So we have about 30 or 40 active members that have attended our various events so far. And what's nice about it is I wanted to do this so we could meet people of similar interests in Houston. There wasn't a place where you could meet people that shared your passions. And the range of what they collect varies wildly. We've got a couple collectors in our group that have extremely high level expensive material and maps and things, Texas maps, and then we have literature collectors, and we have, you know, Latin American and book arts. But anyway, we went to A&M our field trip, and they rolled out the red carpet for us, and we got an inside tour of their special collections. We went to U of H not too long ago. We've gone to some of the houses of the collectors have hosted. So anyway, if you have an interest, there's all different levels, from people that are just kind of starting to collect to advanced collectors. We'd be glad to talk with you. But I wanted to kind of just open up. Anybody has a few questions? Steve?
Kurt talked about advice for the advanced collector. I know you do this, but I would really strongly advise anybody else to as well. The first thing you can do when you examine the book that you've bought is record the names that are inscribed in the book, not just the famous names, but the other names. One is, if you're ever worried about insurance or trying to retrieve a book if it's ever stolen, the best surefire way to identify that copy are the inscribed names, even of unimportant people in the book. Second thing is, with not only Google now, the ability to Google names that are in a book, but also to go on Ancestry.com, because so many people have put a wealth of information about their forebears that all conjoins on the internet now. I found a book recently online with the name of a military officer, Colonel John B. Flagg. It was the Hawthorne, and the name of the fort that he was assigned, and it turned out to be a long-vanished fort in West Texas. So the book was of immediate interest, not to a Hawthorne collector, but to somebody who specializes in material on West Texas and what they were reading in 1860 on the frontier. So you can learn an awful lot, and it can add an awful lot to the value of the book.
Yeah, but Steve, that's basically called provenance. The provenance of a book doesn't mean it has to be somebody famous. It's just previous ownership of a book. And now in the scholarly world, there's a lot of work being done on annotated copies of older books, not by famous people, but just like who was reading the book and how did they read it back in different time periods.
I know. I was getting a book repaired recently, and my book guy said, "Oh, you want me to clean up all this writing on the first few pages?" No. Especially because this was Henry Stimson's grandfather's copy. It was also named Henry Stimson, so it was kind of made it an interesting association copy.
Yeah, so if you buy a book, don't erase the stuff out of the book. Let it have its problem. Yeah.
So does an inscription in a book diminish the value, or how does that affect?
Well, you mean a non-author inscription?
Or
Yeah.
the author signing the book with somebody?
Okay, well, you know, there's different schools about that, and it kind of depends on the area you're dealing in. A lot of modern fiction people seem to like signature only, and part of that is because if it just says to Ralph from somebody, well, that's not a very interesting inscription. I like, you know, some authors are better than others about making interesting inscriptions, so I really like interesting inscriptions rather than just the signature. But you know, so I'd say any author signature helps the book, but if it's just a signature to a person who's not famous, who's not you, and you don't know who it is, that doesn't help as much as a more interesting inscription or a detailed one. I mean, J. Frank Debbie was really good at inscribing books. So I have one copy to a woman named Mary Sue Driver of the Mustangs, and so he's sitting there and he writes, "Mary Sue Driver, it's hard to drive a Mustang, J. Frank Debbie." So those are the kind of inscriptions that I like, where it adds something to the book, or it shows some humor, or, you know, Kurt has a lot of long, interesting, detailed inscriptions. You know, I have some Frank Debbie inscriptions that are like a letter. They're very personal and informative and tell the history of the book and what inspired him to write it and what he thought about the book. And so an inscription like that to a collector is going to be of interest more than just his name. You know, so that's why I never understand modern literature collectors who only want the name, because it's like going to deface the book. Now, Carl Herzog, who is a famous printer, said, you know, the reason we put the half title in the book is so you can scrawl your name on there and not ruin our good design of the title page. So from the book designer person, he's always said, sign the half title page, don't sign the title page.
You know the famous story about Harnett T. Kane, the Louisiana writer, the late Colleen Urbanic, had a standing bet with her customers that if anybody could bring her an unsigned Harnett T. Kane book, she'd pay them 50 cents. I think she only paid twice in her career.
Yeah, there are a few authors where the uninscribed copies are much rarer than the signed and inscribed ones. And as a collector, you need to know that, so you know, so.
What is it about the McMurtry signatures, the early McMurtry signatures that are supposed to be more valuable because you can read them?
Sure.
Yeah, McMurtry, Larry McMurtry, his early inscriptions, you know, he took his time and you could read them, and as he became more famous and more people were trying to get him to sign things, it got shorter and quicker till you barely read it. And when I visited him first time back in like '91, I went into his bookshop in Archer City, and he basically was not signing copies of his own book. You could buy books from him. As a bookseller, it's kind of convenient to be an author. He would sell you copies of his book already signed, but he wouldn't inscribe them. And once he found out that I wasn't an autograph seeker, then he was, oh, you're a book guy, so he'd talk with me. But yeah, he's kind of an extreme case where he went from signing to then you couldn't barely read his inscription to the point where he was like, I just don't want to do this.
And if you want to
anymore.
see one of his early signatures, I have one
got one.
from 1972 in my booth. I'd be happy to show you when you can actually read Larry in there as opposed to you.
Well, and that's a great example. If you're a collector, you can go and if you visit the booths, you can see that kind of stuff and maybe buy something if it tempts you. But yeah, so anyway.
Also, you were mentioning first editions and 1/1s and so forth. Don't a lot of publishers have clues to that?
Yes, there are. How to distinguish a first printing. That's what first edition means, the first printing of a book. To distinguish that among publishers, especially in the 20th century and fiction and stuff, publishers identify their first editions in different ways. For example, Alfred Knopf, famous big publisher, it'll say first edition on the copyright page, and after that they take it off and put the printings usually. But there are guides to that, and that's something if you're a collector and you're really trying to collect literature, I would suggest you can go online now, and this is where you have to, here's the caveat, you go online and you search for these books. Dealers will just copy other dealers' information, and so if somebody makes a mistake, it magnifies itself. So it's best to go to an authoritative source too, and there are books available that identify guides to first editions, and they're not infallible, but they're better than.
Yeah. Well, and if you have an area and you get a bibliography, as we were saying earlier, then they will have the best information about the different editions if someone has written a bibliography in your area. Of course, some people, I was just talking to the guy who's the head of the Rare Book School at University of Virginia. He told me he specifically wanted to collect in an area where there was no bibliography so that he could write the bibliography in his area.
That's a very advanced collecting.
Yeah. But yeah, so if you, it's one of the, I think, best pieces of advice to a beginning collector is get some of the bibliographies, some of the books in your area. You know, Jeff Dyke said until he had a bibliography, he was a book accumulator. He didn't become a book collector until he had a bibliography that could help him, direct his collecting.
Well, in my particular collecting area, not until recently, the Arthur Freeman book, there's been no bibliography per se on literary forgeries that spans all these areas. So, I mean, I started out, and is how I taught myself really, is by reading bookseller catalogs. And then as I read the books, I would make notes of these books, and then I'd find it in bookseller catalog, and so I essentially made my own kind of bibliography just to help me along in my collecting. So every time I found a new book that I didn't know about, I'd put it on my list.
Well, I'm saying with my Latin American collection, even now there are a lot of very important Latin American writers that there aren't reliable checklists of their works. And so I would go over to the University of Texas Latin American collection and go literally through the stacks and pull the books that they had and go through their information and make my own checklist. Now that's kind of fun as a collector. But if you have the information out there, definitely utilize it. And that's, we talk a lot about the internet, but a lot of the booksellers that have come online literally in the last 10 or 15 years, not all the information's online. I mean, you can get bits and pieces of information from looking at other booksellers' stuff, but buy the book. I mean, if there's a bibliography in your area, don't rely on just the online stuff. Get the book as well. It's well worth the investment of whatever it's going to cost you to buy that item. So, any other questions?
What's your opinion about price guides for books?
Well, the printed price guides are kind of extinct now. There's a whole series before the internet. There was Van Allen Bradley in the 70s, and then Alan Ahern and his wife. You could go buy a book that had price guide and it'll list off book. Now there's those that are actually still somewhat valuable. The prices are out of date, but they do contain a lot of bibliographic information. So even if you find a Alan Ahern price guide from 95 or 2000, I would still buy one and have it on my shelf. You can find them for a few dollars usually in the used bookstores because they'll give you information. But in terms of pricing, now people usually go and look at the websites to see what the other dealers are pricing material at, and then you can easily access, that's for free. And then there's a website called Rare Book Hub that for a modest amount, if you really get into it, you can get a subscription and access the auction records. I use that a lot for my appraisal business.
Yeah, there's a free site called liveauctioneers.com that you can search some recent auction records. You can search Heritage's auction records and online. They're included in Live Auctioneers. There's also something called the World Catalog. WorldCat used to be called OCLC, which you can now search for free online. Used to be a very expensive subscription, and you can see how many holdings libraries have in the United States primarily, some overseas. But so if you're trying to get an idea of a book that is, how many libraries hold copies of it, if there are no copies on the World Catalog, then you might have something kind of interesting, at least as far as that goes.
And yeah, that's a good point. The WorldCat is important as well. For example, there's a couple authors I got interested in, and I wasn't sure what their first publication was. And so I went on to WorldCat, and WorldCat is a compilation of thousands of libraries. I mean, and most of the top ones are on there. You got UT, Harvard, Yale, Rice, all of them. And I search by author, and then they can sort it by date. And so I would look and I'd say, I didn't know that he had a book published in 1942 or an off-print. So it's not infallible, but that's a great resource as well when you're doing research and you're trying to, you discovered this author, you think they're really good, you'd like to find out what they wrote, and there's no formal bibliography. You can go to WorldCat and put your own little bibliography together and then go and search for these things. And you're often hunting, so to speak. So.
And you can also use books on the subject matter, because oftentimes they'll have a bibliography of the books they used to write the book about your subject matter. So even if there's not a formal bibliography, for example, there's a guy who's important in the cattle industry named John Clay, and a biography of him came out about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And I found many interesting books I didn't know about in the bibliography.
And that's just what we can finish up here. I don't want to keep people too long, but one thing that's kind of fun that I've been doing, if you get a good biography, you can base a collection around it now. You read the biography and you make that, your collecting's focus. And if it's a well-done biography, there's all sorts of offshoots and people that were, friends of the author that you go, I didn't know that, and you can go different directions. So there's as many things out there to collect as there are books, basically. But, I hope this was helpful. I hope I enjoyed doing this with these two colleagues of mine. And we're available for questions afterward, and we'd be glad to help you out. And we'd love to see you, if you're local, of course, to join our club and participate in some of the activities. So, any more
Thanks,
questions?
Kurt.
Thanks.
thank you so much to the three of you. And also, if you all would, on the way out, fill out a survey and let us know what you think. Let us know if there's something else you'd like to hear in the theater at our book fair. We'd like to know if this was useful to you and if there's other topics or offshoots that would interest you. Please let us know. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Keelan. Thanks for coming.